In this video, I want to go over some common bad arguments that I have heard regarding racism. Of course, it is my opinion they are bad, although some of them are just factually incorrect and some contain logical fallacies, etc. So I'll leave it up to you to decide. I will also be including my responses to these arguments, and you may consider using these responses in any conversations you have.
The first common argument I hear often is the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Well, this is just factually incorrect, and I can prove it to you, and I will shortly. Um, but I will say that no war is caused by one single issue, and no civil war, and the Civil War in America is no different. However, anyone who claims slavery wasn't the foremost issue of the Civil War is either outright lying to you or has never looked this information up and is just misled and wildly ignorant, and they shouldn't be speaking on it as if they know what they are talking about. I don't mean to be rude, but don't make claims that you don't about things you don't know about. The people who started the Civil War and seceded from the Union in the South, when they were starting their own country, the Confederacy, they had no desire to be politically correct in 2021, and they had no need to lie or hide their racism. They openly declared their racism and support for slavery as a major cause of succession from the America, and they wrote down their complaints in the Articles of Succession. These are basically like the Declaration of Independence, except for the Confederacy. And you can read these online, and I will link them. So let's take a look at some of the states and what they have to say about why they seceded from the Union. You can go and read the whole documents, which I have done myself, and there's many more examples of racism throughout these documents, open and public, because they had no reason to hide it. But I am just going to go over some of them. In the Article of Secession from Georgia, the second sentence into the document is, for the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. By contrast, the second sentence in our Declaration of Independence is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sentence is famous, and it is the core of what the Declaration of Independence is about, and that is why it's first at the top of the Declaration of Independence. Now, you could claim that's not why Georgia has that at the top, but just look through and see what the rest of it says. Second one, Mississippi. Second sentence again. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. And there is more on slavery. This is only one more sentence on it, though there's more. It advocates, this is about, this section was complaining about the restrictions on slavery in their state that was given by the rest of America. It advocates Negro equality, socially and politically, and promotes insurrection and incendiarism in our midst. And they were saying this is a bad thing. South Carolina. By the action of the non-slaveholding states, those states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states, property being the slaves, and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, and they have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. So again, they're complaining about the slaves not being happy about being slaves. And, well, I mean, what else do you have to say? That's about slavery. Texas has a lot. Here's a quote. Texas abandoned her separate national existence and consented to become one of the Confederated Union. She was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Another quote. Based upon an unnatural feeling of hostilities by Northerners to these Southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, so they're calling African slavery beneficent, as in beneficial, proclaiming the debased doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy, the recognition of political equality between the white and Negro races. So they're complaining about people wanting equality between the races, basically. One more example. That in this free government, all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations. While the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon desolation upon the 15 slave-holding states. So, anyone who's complaining or saying that the Civil War was not about slavery is incorrect. And even if they had been correct, which they're not, so what? Slavery is still bad. Next bad argument. The Confederate flag is my heritage. The Confederate flag was used for about 5 years, very close to the same amount of time the Nazi flag was used. Both were used for only approximately the extent of their respective wars, and both were forever tied to the hate and violence symbolized by those wars. Imagine Germans flying the Nazi flag when you ask them about it, they claim it's just their heritage, and they wish to promote their heritage with a flag. No honest person is going to think that is a reasonable position, or that is their real reason. In the case of the Confederate flag, it was not banned, so people still flew it. And in the beginning, just like with the Articles of Succession, they made no secret to what it represented. Over time, though, it became untenable to be so horrifically openly racist, and people started rewriting the history to make it seem PC. They claimed the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and they claimed the flag is just about their heritage. This is very related to the concept of dog whistling, where, on the surface, what you are saying sounds mostly reasonable and not blatantly racist, but the intention is implied and understood by everyone. This gives the racist person plausible deniability. What about freedom of speech? When people bring up freedom of speech, they often mean I should be able to say what I want with no consequence. And that's just not how it works or how it should work. There are legitimate concerns about freedom of speech, and it's worthwhile to discuss them, but that is out of the context of this video. You have to be careful to consider the context of what a person is saying when it is brought up. But let's consider the legal consequence versus the social consequence. Excluding the extremes like yelling fire, generally in America you are allowed to legally say whatever you wish without legal consequences. You can go on TV and shout the N-word, for instance, and you won't be jailed. But you will likely to be banned from the TV and probably fired from your job and shunned on social media. These are not legal consequences, they are social consequences. Societies have a second tier of consequences to help communities run smoothly. The first tier is legal consequences from lawsuits, prison, to community service. The second tier, as I'm defining it, is where individuals choose how they will interact with another person who is deemed not respectable in some way. This is mostly a good thing. I'm not talking about vigilante justice. That is when someone takes illegal action. I am talking about how people can choose to not interact with anyone they want. Some places have this encoded in their laws, like China's social credit. I personally think this is terrible. I think it is important to have it not codified into law, but for it to be organic, and it gives more power to people to choose as a group what is acceptable or not. To summarize, you have freedom of speech to say racist and sexist things, but when you face social repercussions, I don't care about your whining. Freedom of speech is a complex topic, but often these arguments are simply dog whistles and blatant bullshit in an attempt to troll or obstruct mature, reasonable conversation from taking place. What about cancel culture? This and freedom of speech are major topics in themselves, and I won't be covering them in depth here. What I do say about it here is only from the context of a conversation about racism in America. Basically, to me, this boils down to the same response nearly as the free speech question. You can say what you want, but you should expect social consequences from your speech. I hope to eventually cover my thoughts on cancel culture more broadly later on in its own video or perhaps video series, but that's all I will say about it here. Next argument. I have a black friend or coworker and they've never thought I was racist. Without knowing more about the person saying this, we don't know if they're racist or not, and I wouldn't want to judge someone on such a simple statement. But I would like to talk about the statement itself and what it means. First of all, a person in a coworker situation or even in a friend group might not be comfortable confronting someone who is saying racist things and acting insensitively. It's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, and it could alienate them from the group if the person they are approaching gets offended and attacks them more, then they could end up getting fired from their job. They could end up feeling awkward in the friend group and eventually leaving. And people have gone through these things and they learn to practice defensive appeasing. of this type of person, uh, oftentimes. Also, I'll just point out that having a black friend does not make you not racist. Just like having a wife does not make you not sexist. There are sexist people who are married, and there are also rapists who are married, who are also sexist, unsurprisingly. Uh, and generally, when it comes to people having like minority friends when they're racist, is they see them as individuals once they get to know them. Not always, but oftentimes, and they think to themselves or say to others, "Oh well, Jim is one of the good ones," implying that the other ones aren't, or they are the exception to the rule. Uh, and lastly, I'll just say that saying no one has come up to me and said I was racist is a pretty absurd statement. Um, if the logic behind it is that proves I'm not racist, because you have to do work on yourself. You have to look inside yourself. You have to look at the facts around you. People are not always going to be comfortable coming up to you and telling you this or that thing. And I would also say I expect a lot of times that when people say that, they probably have been called racist, but they just dismiss it as an absurd statement and move on and don't think about that and don't consider that. Uh, but, that's just a kind of a hypothetical situation there. So, on to the next. I'm attracted to black girls. I even dated one, so obviously I'm not racist. This does not mean a person isn't racist. Consider someone saying a man who is attracted to women obviously can't be sexist. That would be absurd for basically the same reason. This isn't to say a person who is attracted to a black woman is racist, but rather it doesn't indicate that they aren't racist. A person in the KKK can be attracted to a black woman and want to have sex with him, but still be racist. Um, so racism generally refers to outside of your inner circle, because my common saying is like, you are one of the good ones, making an exception for a specific person. Um, when people start to know someone and get to know them as an individual, sometimes but not always, they start seeing them as a human being. Um, but they still hold the general bias against another race and various negative whatever, hate and whatnot that they have. But they see this one specific person as not like the other ones. But they're still racist. George Washington, he impregnated a black slave, and she had a child, and in fact, she was a child herself at the time. But guess what? He's still racist. So I don't. There's nothing else to say here. I guess it's just not a good argument. You shouldn't use it. If you're attracted to black girls or you dated one, it doesn't mean you're not racist. Doesn't mean you are. Do some self-reflection and figure out whether or not you are, and if you are, change it. The next argument I have mainly heard during Obama's presidency. The argument is Obama proves racism is over. Well, no, he doesn't. um, first of all, there have been over 40 presidents, and there's about 13% black population, with a lot of other minorities in America. And this is the first non-white president we've had, which is to say that it's still minorities are still drastically underrepresented in the presidency. So we have a long way to go, but it's a good milestone along the journey towards ending racism. Obama is the first black president ever in the USA, and throughout his presidency, he was aggressively attacked by the media. Um, I will link a video below from Fox News, a compilation of things he was attacked for, like wearing a tan suit, like eating Dijon mustard. It's absurd things. Trump, people will argue, well, Trump was attacked too. But first of all, recall that his first days in office, he aggressively attacked the media, uh, provoking a response, and he thrived on controversy. People will tell me in the same breath that Trump was unfairly attacked by the media, but that he was also trolling and loved to get people heated and angry at him, including the media. Just watch his news conferences. Watch his first news conference where he attacks reporters from groups that he doesn't like. So you can have it both ways for yourself and live in your delusional world, or you can accept reality and have a real discussion about it. It's up to you. Lastly, on this subject, consider Trump's wife and Michelle Obama. Trump's wife posed nude, which I do not have a problem with. But had Michelle Obama posed nude, conservatives would have aggressively attacked her, and Obama as being whatever slurs for black people that they would have, being hood or whatever else, saying they're unfit for the presidency. But when it comes to Trump, they don't do that. So I find that interesting. Had Obama had multiple ex-wives, how would conservatives feel over that? That with Trump, they've exposed, or Trump has exposed, not on purpose, but exposed the hypocrisy of many, but not all, many conservatives. We went from people being epileptic about Clinton getting a blowjob to all of the things that Trump does and represents. And we just see the hypocrisy from night and day. So I just find that interesting. All lives matter. I agree that all lives should matter. That's not why it's offensive. I agree in theory with it. The problem is that it's a response to a previous argument or statement, Black Lives Matter. And if we just break down what Black Lives Matter mean, we can understand the problem here. Black Lives Matter is, first of all, when we're talking about both of these statements, we can look at them as either talking about what is really happening in our society right now, or we can look at them as an ideal principle about how things ought to be and what is right, what is moral. So, first of all, Black Lives Matter is a statement about what is right and what is moral. And it is implying that black lives currently do not matter in our society, in real life, in actuality. And we can see that with how they are treated by the police, by hospitals, by the media, etc., etc. The response statement of All Lives Matter is meant to muddy and confuse, convolute the first statement. You're not actually adding anything new, because the first statement is not saying that white lives don't matter. It's just that white people are not under attack in the way that black people are, um, and other minorities. So there's no reason. It's like if if my house is on fire, and I shout out, "Hey, my house is on fire," um, and my neighbor says, "Well, what about my house?" When his house is not on fire, then my neighbor is an asshole, right? uh, my house is the one that's on fire. I'm pointing that out. And I say, my house matters. Let's deal with that. And my neighbor is like, well, what about my house? Like, there's a little flame on my shed. Yeah, well, let's deal with where the fire is. Let's put it out. That's what's best. Don't be an asshole and try to um, confuse and stop progress. Stop being regressive. One other thing here, people who say blue lives matter, I'll just keep this real simple. The claim about this is, or the implied meaning here is that police lives matter. Um, Police is a profession and is not under attack the same way. They are paid. They have huge amounts of support. They are adults who take on a risk of a job that is dangerous. Um, and they are compensated. So it's not the same thing. And furthermore, green lives matter. Loggers have a more dangerous job cutting down trees than police do. So why aren't these people out talking about logger lives matter? It's it's a it's a silly claim that's just, again, meant to detract from the original phrase of Black Lives Matter and should not be taken seriously. There's no way to take it seriously. I'm colorblind. When I look at you, I don't see color. I think it's important to try to understand what a person is intending to communicate when something is said. And when a person says this, it's something positive. They are saying they don't discriminate against a person because of their race. But the way they are saying it is that they don't recognize a person's race. And it's not quite the same thing. I don't mean to condemn anyone who's using this. It's not a horrible thing to say or anything. And I hope it doesn't come off as me just nitpicking the smallest little things and attacking people for that. I certainly used this phrase at one point or another a long time ago. On one hand, I acknowledge and understand that when a person says this, they are often, or nearly always, well-meaning and earnest. And I believe I've even heard people of color using this phrase. So, again, I'm not attacking a person's character. However, there is a difference. Race does matter in our world as it exists now, even though it shouldn't. Being colorblind can imply race doesn't affect identity, history, struggle, challenges, obstacles. It's a form of erasure, which is not intended, of course, but that is or can be a major problem. So just my suggestion is to consider the implications of the difference between recognizing a person's race and racial discrimination against a person. Race affects how people are treated and the opportunities that they have. So ignoring their race is not acknowledging their hardships. It's looking at a disadvantaged person and saying, I don't see your disadvantage. And that's why it's problematic. Black people are generally lazy. I'm not saying it's in their DNA or something. I'm not racist. I just think their culture is the problem. They have a culture of laziness. This is a terrible, terrible argument and statement, and shouldn't really be taken seriously. Someone is trolling or ignorant if they make this statement. This entirely overlooks all the provable hardships black people have gone through, and not to mention when they were slaves, they worked a lot harder and were far less lazy than the white people in the country. White people took credit for a lot of things that minorities did for them, or for whatever, because they were slaves or whatever else. And to this day, there's plenty of incredibly hardworking black people and other minorities. And ironically, the person who would make this claim could have looked this information up, but was way too lazy themselves, just contradicting their own statement and being a hypocrite. So I've just gone through the bad arguments section. And there are some which I did cover that should go in this next section, but I put them there anyways, or at least they could have gone here. But this section is about factoids. It's a continuation of the bad arguments, but sometimes I've come to see a pattern in some of these arguments where they just bring up things that don't, as far as I can tell, don't really imply any kind of actual argument. It's just kind of whataboutism. It's just about, here's a factoid, and it just dilutes the conversation. I think it comes from a place of defensiveness. For whatever reason, they feel defensive about America or white America or Southern America or their ancestors or something like that. They feel attacked personally for some reason. Maybe they should detach their identity from that, and they have a hard time doing that. I'm not really sure why these arguments come up. Maybe someone who's used these arguments can comment on why they feel that these types of arguments are useful, if they do feel they're useful, because to me, they just seem to be useless. Like, they belong in a history book or in a conversation about history, and perhaps sometimes I have had a conversation about history where it might be relevant to mention these things. But often it comes in conversations that are about racism, and they are phrased or stated in a way that implies it's some kind of gotcha or debunks something I am saying. I wanted to make another point here regarding defensiveness and excuses in people. I have an analogy. Imagine a man assaults his wife physically and then 5 years later is quote unquote reformed. You may be very forgiving of him and take his actions at face value, giving him the benefit of the doubt. But then you talk to him about how he abused her, and he says, well, one time she called me really hurtful names. You may begin to wonder, reasonably so, why he would mention that, and if he leaves it there, it sounds like a poor attempt to excuse his actions, and lessen and spread the blame to other people besides himself for his own actions. And this is similar in type to how people throw out these factoids oftentimes. Not always, but oftentimes. So keep an eye out for that in conversations and even in yourself. And let's go over some of these factoids. There were white slaves in America too. This is the first factoid um, that seems to imply some kind of gotcha or something like, therefore what? Therefore what? First of all, black slaves were always the core of the institution of slavery, and in the years leading up to the Civil War, this became more and more the case, such that by the time the Civil War happened, it was nearly all black slaves. Furthermore, um, here's a quote about indentured servitude, which is a form of slavery where white people and various people of European descent were enslaved, but not in the same way as black people. Here we go. But indentured servitude, by definition, came nowhere close to chattel slavery. For one thing, it was temporary. All but the most serious felons were freed at the end of their contracts. The colonial system also offered more lenient punishment for disobedient servants than enslaved people, and allowed servants to petition for early release if their masters mistreated them. Most importantly, servitude wasn't hereditary. Children of indentured servants were born free. Slaves' children were property of their owners. White slaves were treated better generally and had laws protecting them. In most cases of white slavery, it was indentured servitude. Slavery is bad regardless of race, of course. The question is, why bring this factoid up in the first place? Think that through and ask that of someone who uses this factoid as some kind of implied argument. Ask them for the precise argument they are making. The key word you can use, I think, is therefore. There were white slaves in America too. Therefore, your argument ... Africans had slaves and treated each other horribly too. That's just how it was. Let's move on. The context of this argument and how it's made matters. Yes, Africans had slaves. And yes, at times they were treated horridly. So what? Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because they did it too does not make slavery in America better. People making this argument, I feel defensive about the subject of slavery. Maybe they feel defensive on behalf of America itself, or the people living in America 150 years ago, especially Southerners. And I can kind of understand this, but it is a confusing idea to me, because yes, things were different back then, and yeah, there were terrible people doing terrible things, but who cares? You were not one of them. Your parents were not one of them. You don't need to feel shame or defensiveness. There's great things about America and there's terrible things about America, both in its past and today. And you can be open and admit that and acknowledge and own that and not be lesser for it. We should move on in theory. How do we move on though? By ending slavery and repairing the damage that it caused. And not just slavery, but racism and bias. And that includes all sorts of things other than slavery, like redlining and the KKK and all sorts of bias laws and corruption. So this argument, I feel, is only made in defense of something that doesn't need defending. So I just think it's a poor argument that is entirely unnecessary. Only a small percentage of Southerners owned enslaved people. First of all, before I go into the meaning behind someone using this argument. Let's just talk about the factoid itself. This is from History.com. The 1860 consensus, at the start of the Civil War, shows that in the states that would soon secede from the Union, where most or all of the slaves were, an average of more than 32% of white families owned enslaved people. So even those families and people who did not own slaves, the white people, they still benefited from slavery existing and the racism around them. They were held, poor whites were held in higher regard than poor blacks and enslaved blacks. So they reaped a higher status than they would otherwise have, um, and had white privilege. And furthermore, blacks were given, and other minorities were given the riskiest jobs, the most dangerous jobs, the most terrible jobs, working on farms, building buildings and roads, and on chain gangs and wherever else that no one else would do, and given little to no money and compensation, and lived in horrible conditions, etc., etc. So yes, not all Southerners own slaves, but this comes down to, so what? Like, not all Southerners own slaves. Therefore, what are you saying? It's a factoid, sure. What? How is that relevant? That's all I would ask. Lincoln was a Republican. This is an argument I've heard recently quite a bit. And again, so what? Therefore, what? This was 160, 70 years ago. The Republican Party has changed dramatically. You can even see the Republican Party changing dramatically in the last 10 years. The Republican Party bears no resemblance to what the Republican Party was back then. It's irrelevant. You don't get brownie points for what a politician did way before you were born. Okay? So yes, the effects of what Lincoln did are felt today, and yes, he was a Republican, but it doesn't matter. You don't get brownie points for sticking, it's like if, I don't know the history of Hitler's party, if he started his own party, or if it previously existed. But if he had taken over some party that had done something great 150 years ago, then he wouldn't get credit for that in his own actions, right? You're responsible for your actions, not, you don't get credit for people that were born or lived way before you were born. My ancestors were poor and didn't own slaves. Classism is an important issue, but white privilege still exists. One doesn't cancel out the other. I don't know if my ancestors owned slaves. It doesn't really matter a lot. I know I have white privilege. I know it may be the case that to some degree if my ancestors did own slaves, I had extra privilege from work done by slaves that I benefited from. But I already mentioned that even if white people didn't own slaves, they still benefited from the racism and bias. So in that way, I and my ancestors benefited from that as well. So it's still a problem that needs to be fixed and worked on in our own society today. People who are making the argument my ancestors were poor and didn't own slaves, if they are viewing that as an argument and not just a factoid, as I was mentioning earlier, I don't get what they are trying to say other than therefore I don't need to think about my white privilege because I'm poor. Well, there's poor black people who don't have white privilege. So no matter what position you are in, if you are in prison for something you didn't do, if you are homeless, if you are, have disabilities, if you are completely broke, it doesn't matter. Those things, it would be even worse if you didn't have white privilege. You would be more likely to encounter racism, any, encounters with people in power. They're more likely to be of a different race. They're more likely to judge you. So if someone said that to me now, I would just ask them to continue the statement and continue it to its conclusion. Therefore, what are you saying about yourself? What's the point of that factoid? I would like to add that one of my parents is from the northern states, and as far as I know, they didn't own slaves, and one of my parents is from the southern states, and as far as I know, their ancestors did not own slaves. But in both of these cases, even if that's the case and there were no slaves owned, I don't get any brownie points for what my ancestors did. I don't get credit for anything my ancestors did. If I'm related to Martin Luther King or Gandhi or whoever, I don't get credit for that. They worked hard and did what they did. They stood up for what was right, not me. I'm not saying I'm not standing up for what's right, but I don't get credit for other people's actions. I get credit for my own action. So it applies to me too. Just like Republicans don't get credit for Lincoln being Republican, I don't get credit for anything people did that is not me, basically. So, yeah. So that wraps up the common bad arguments that I've heard and made a list of here. There's other ones and there's other topics that I want to get to in this video, but this is the end of this video. I wanted to make one last point though on something I've heard before here, and that is racism is all but gone. You're just trying to play the victim, etc. This is blatantly false. I think it's clear to see in today's society that racism is out there, and I think most people who are saying something like that are being just disingenuous. And I wanted to make one point about an exception here, and that may be people who have a very specific definition of racism. Now they're still ignorant about the topic, like very, very much so, and that is a them problem that they should change. But in my next video, I'm going to be covering the definition of racism and how some people understand the definition to be differently, and how that can be confusing in conversations where people can talk past each other without even knowing it, and two people could be honestly trying to have a real conversation, but their definitions are different from each other, and one person feels attacked or defensive and the other person feels like the other person is not listening to them or something. So I will be going over that in my next video. Stick around. Thanks for watching.